The names of certain sources in this narrative have been changed or omitted to protect their safety. The events described are drawn from documented records, first-hand interviews, and sourced material gathered over a period of 3 years. The investigation is ongoing. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I had been lying awake anyway, staring at the water stain on my ceiling that looked like a dog running, and when my phone lit up the room, I almost didn't answer it. Unknown number, New York area code, but not one I recognized. I let it ring 4 times. Then something, I still can't explain what, made me pick up. There was breathing on the other end. Heavy, measured breathing, like someone who had been running and was trying to sound calm. "You wrote about Donato Marchetti," the voice said. It wasn't a question. It was a man's voice, older, raspy, with an accent that sat somewhere between Brooklyn and somewhere much further away, somewhere with cobblestones and salt air. I said yes. I had written about Marchetti. A piece for a Philadelphia magazine, published 18 months earlier, about the Marchetti family's real estate holdings along the Delaware waterfront. A piece that my editor had gutted so thoroughly that by the time it ran, it read more like a business profile than the investigation I had intended. "You got it wrong," the man said. "Not wrong like mistakes. Wrong like you didn't know what you were looking at." I sat up. I turned on the lamp beside my bed. "Then tell me what I was looking at," I said. There was a long pause. I heard traffic in the background, a truck, the hiss of air brakes. "Donato Marchetti has been dead for 11 years, the man said. "The man you interviewed. The man you had lunch with at that restaurant on Walnut Street. The man who showed you his permits and his architecture awards and his photograph with the mayor. That man is not Donato Marchetti." Then he hung up. I sat there in my bed in my apartment in Philadelphia at 2:47 in the morning, holding my phone, and I thought, this is either the most important phone call I have ever received, or someone is playing a very dangerous game with me. What I did not know then, what I could not have known, was that both things were true. My name is Sarah Voss. I am an investigative journalist. I have been doing this work for 14 years, and in that time I have written about corruption, about fraud, about the slow, grinding machinery by which powerful men protect themselves from consequences. I have received threats. I have had sources go silent on me, sometimes for reasons I understood and sometimes for reasons I never learned. I have sat across from people I knew were lying to me and watched them smile. I thought I had seen most of what this work could show me. I had not seen this. What I am about to tell you is the story of a man who died twice. Of a family that built an empire on the bones of other people's secrets. Of a federal witness who walked away from the most heavily guarded protection program in American history and built a new life so completely, so meticulously, so ruthlessly, that for more than a decade, nobody looked too hard at the seams. Of the corruption that made it possible. And of what happens when a journalist starts pulling on a thread that people with very serious resources and very limited patience do not want pulled. This is a story about identity and erasure, about what a man will do to survive, and what he will sacrifice, and who he will become when the person he used to be is buried in a cemetery in New Jersey under a headstone with his own name on it. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I am telling you this story because I believe you need to know it. I am telling it to you in this form, recorded, distributed, already out in the world before anyone can make a phone call and ask me nicely to reconsider, because I have learned over the last 3 years that the only real protection a journalist has is an audience. Silence is not safety. Silence is just a different kind of danger. Some of what I am going to tell you is documented. I have the documents. Some of it is reconstructed from interviews, from sources whose identities I am protecting, from records that I obtained through methods that were legal but that certain people would very much prefer I had not used. And some of it, a small part, but an important part, is inference. When I make an inference, I will tell you. I will not dress speculation up as certainty. There has been too much of that in this story already. Let's go back to the beginning. Not my beginning. The real beginning. In the summer of 1987, a man named Vincent Caruso sat in a federal building in Manhattan and began to talk. Caruso was 41 years old at the time. He had spent the previous 19 years working for the Genovese crime family, which by that point was arguably the most powerful organized crime organization in the United States. He had started as a driver, become an earner, and eventually risen to a position that federal prosecutors described in their charging documents as a senior operational coordinator for the family's financial infrastructure in the Mid-Atlantic region. What that meant, in practice, was that Vincent Caruso knew where the money went. He knew which banks, which shell companies, which real estate LLCs, which lawyers, which accountants, and which judges had their hands in the Genovese family's business. He knew things that prosecutors had been trying to learn for 20 years. He also knew, because he was not an unintelligent man, that he was looking at spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary if he didn't give them something extraordinary. And so he did. What Caruso gave the government over the course of 8 months of debriefings, testimony preparation, and grand jury appearances was, by the account of the prosecutors who worked with him, unlike anything they had seen from an organized crime witness up to that point. He gave them names, he gave them dates, he gave them account numbers, routing numbers, property addresses, transaction records that he had memorized with the kind of obsessive precision that certain men develop when they understand that their survival depends on it. He gave them 3 sitting judges, 2 state senators, a deputy commissioner in the New York City Department of Buildings, and a network of financial instruments so elaborate and so deeply embedded in legitimate commerce that one prosecutor later said, privately, that pulling it apart was like trying to separate a vine from a wall. You could take the vine, but the wall would never look the same. In exchange, Vincent Caruso received the standard benefits of the Witness Security Program, which the public knows as WITSEC and which the government manages with a seriousness that is genuine even when it is imperfect. He received a new identity. He received relocation. He received money, not a lot of money by the standards of the people he had worked for. But enough. He received, in theory, protection. He was declared officially dead in November of 1988. The cause of death was listed as a myocardial infarction. There was a funeral in Staten Island, attended by family members who had been told different things by different people and who understood, if they were paying attention, that the casket was not something they should ask too many questions about. There is a grave in a cemetery on Staten Island with Vincent Caruso's name on it. I have been there. I stood in front of it on a Tuesday morning in October, 2 years ago, and I took a photograph of the stone with my phone. It is a modest stone. It says his name and his dates and it says, "Beloved Father." That last part is complicated, for reasons I will get to. The program worked. For a while, the program absolutely worked. The prosecutions that resulted from Caruso's cooperation sent 14 men to federal prison, dismantled a money laundering operation that had been running for more than a decade, and created, for the Genovese family, a period of disruption and reorganization that changed the architecture of their power in ways that are still felt today. Vincent Caruso had done what he was supposed to do. He had burned down the house and walked away from the ashes. And then, somewhere between 1988 and the early 1990s, and I cannot tell you exactly when, because this is one of the pieces I cannot fully document, though I have my strong suspicions, something went wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not at first, but wrong in the way that things go wrong when human beings are involved in any system, no matter how carefully designed, wrong because of weakness and greed, and the particular vulnerability that comes from wanting something so badly that you will do almost anything to get it. What Vincent Caruso wanted, I believe, was to go home. Not home to Staten Island. Not home to the life that had put him in a federal witness room in the first place. But home to something like what he had known, the scale of it, the energy of it, the feeling of moving through the world as a man who mattered, who had resources, who could pick up a phone and have things happen. The program gave him anonymity and safety, but it could not give him that. It could not give him back the particular aliveness that certain men feel only when they are playing at a level where the stakes are real and the consequences are serious. I believe, and this is inference, but it is inference grounded in everything I have learned, that Vincent Caruso began making quiet contact with people from his former life within 3 years of entering the program. Not with the Genovese family. He wasn't suicidal, but with people adjacent to that world, people who had their own reasons for discretion, people who understood how to build things in the dark. People who could use a man with his particular combination of skills and knowledge and complete, legal non-existence. The name he had been given by the program was Robert Fisk. He lived in Phoenix for several years. He had a legitimate job, a modest apartment, a life carefully designed to be unremarkable. And then, gradually, over time, Robert Fisk began to acquire things. A business, then another business, then properties, then a corporation, and another corporation, and a set of relationships with financial institutions in 3 different states that were, to anyone who looked at them from the surface, completely legitimate. And then, sometime in the mid-1990s, Robert Fisk moved to Philadelphia. And somewhere in the process of that move, Robert Fisk became Donato Marchetti. How do you become someone else? Not just legally, not just on paper, but completely. The history, the relationships, the professional identity, the social texture that makes a person real to the world around them? This is one of the questions that consumed me during the 3 years I spent working on this story. And I want to walk you through what I found, because the answer is more straightforward than you might expect, and more disturbing. You don't do it alone. You can't. You need help. You need people who can create records, not just forge documents, though that's part of it, but create the kind of layered, cross-referenced institutional memory that makes an identity feel real when someone looks at it sideways. You need a lawyer who doesn't ask too many questions. You need a banker, or someone who can reach a banker. You need, ideally, someone with access to a state or local government apparatus who can ensure that certain searches turn up what you want them to turn up and not what you don't. And you need money, a significant amount of money, which, if you have spent the previous several years quietly building a financial infrastructure that runs parallel to your official identity, you might have. Donato Marchetti appeared in Philadelphia's business records in 1996. He had a history. A carefully constructed history that placed him in Pittsburgh in the 1980s. In real estate development, with references that checked out because the people providing them were either paid or complicit or both. He had education records from a university that, when you called their alumni office, confirmed his degree because someone at that office had been reached in advance. He had the architecture awards I mentioned, the professional affiliations, the magazine profiles. By the time I met him in 2019, he had been Donato Marchetti for more than 20 years. He had been Donato Marchetti longer than he had been Vincent Caruso in any operational sense. He had a daughter who knew him only as her father, Donato. He had employees who respected him. He had a photograph with the mayor. And he had, underneath all of it, a financial operation of considerable sophistication that was moving money. Drug money, extortion money, the proceeds of crimes committed by people he had never met and would never meet, through his real estate holdings, his construction projects, his network of LLCs, washing it clean and returning it to circulation as legitimate capital. He had not gone home. He had built a new home. And then he had invited the same darkness into it. After that phone call, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee that went cold, and I spent the rest of the night going back through everything I had written about Marchetti, everything I had found, everything I had chosen not to pursue because it didn't fit the story I thought I was telling. There were things I had noticed and set aside, small things, the kind of things that register in the back of a journalist's mind as slightly off but not off enough to follow. Not when your editor is asking for a draft and your sources are getting nervous and the whole investigation has already been narrowed to a manageable scope. A discrepancy in a property transfer date that I had chalked up to recording error. A shell company that appeared in the ownership chain of one of Marchetti's waterfront properties that seemed to have no other purpose, no employees, no filings beyond the minimum, a registered agent address that turned out to be a UPS store in Wilmington, Delaware. A name I had come across twice in different contexts that I hadn't connected at the time. A man named Patrick Sull, listed once as a consultant on a construction project and once as a signatory on a bank account associated with one of Marchetti's LLCs. I wrote that name on a piece of paper. Patrick Sull. I circled it. The next day, I called a source I have used for years, a woman who works in financial compliance and who has, over the course of our professional relationship, become one of the most valuable people I know. I'm going to call her Margaret, which is not her name, because even now, after everything, her safety matters more to me than her credit. I described what I was looking at, without giving her the name. I asked her what a structure like this, the LLCs, the registered agent, the pattern of property transfers, would look like if it were being used to launder money. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It would look exactly like what you're describing." She walked me through it, carefully and in detail, and what she described was a technique called layering, the practice of moving money through multiple transactions and multiple entities to obscure its origin. You take dirty money and you invest it in a construction project. The construction project generates revenue, real revenue, from real tenants, supplemented by inflated invoices and fictitious subcontractors. That revenue goes back out as legitimate profit. By the time it reaches the top of the structure, it's clean. It has a paper trail. It has tax records. It has the imprimatur of a legitimate business. The only way to find what's underneath is to go transaction by transaction, entity by entity, and have enough of the picture to know what you're looking for. I did not have enough of the picture yet, but I was beginning to understand the shape of it. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what journalists do in the early stages of an investigation that has the potential to be very serious. I did nothing that would alert anyone to what I was doing. I worked quietly. I pulled public records, property filings, corporate registrations, court documents, UCC filings, anything that was publicly accessible and didn't require me to make inquiries that might be noticed. I built a map on a large piece of paper taped to the wall of my home office, entities, names, dates, connections, question marks. It was not elegant. It was a mess. But messes are how you find things. The Patrick Sull connection was the first real break. Patrick Sull, I discovered, had a history that was not hard to find if you knew where to look, but that was structured in a way that discouraged casual inquiry. He had a professional profile that described him as a real estate consultant with a background in construction finance. He had a business address in Wilmington. He had a LinkedIn page with a modest number of connections and a photograph in which he looked like exactly what he claimed to be, a middle-aged professional in a blazer. The kind of man you would see in a hotel lobby and immediately forget. But Patrick Sull also had a sealed court record in New Jersey from 1994. The sealing itself was not unusual. It might have been any number of things. But the docket number, which I found through a source in the federal court system who was willing to tell me that much and no more, was associated with a case category that court professionals would recognize as related to witness or informant proceedings. It was a classification that I had seen before, in other contexts, and it meant something specific. Patrick Sull had, at some point in the early 1990s, had a relationship with federal law enforcement that someone had gone to significant lengths to make invisible. I sat with that for a while. I thought about what my midnight caller had said, that the man I interviewed was not Donato Marchetti, that the real Donato Marchetti had been dead for 11 years. If that was true, and I was not yet prepared to say that it was, but I was no longer prepared to say that it wasn't, then who was he? And how had he gotten here? And who had helped him? Patrick Sull, I was beginning to think, was part of the answer to that third question. The second break came from a source I had not expected, from a direction I had not anticipated. A man, I will call him Eddie, who worked in the Philadelphia District Attorney's office contacted me. Not to talk, not yet. He sent me, through an intermediary I trust, a single document. It was a photocopy of a real estate appraisal from 2003, prepared for a property on the waterfront that was now one of Marchetti's flagship developments. The appraisal was unremarkable in itself. What was remarkable was the handwritten note in the margin, in ink that had faded slightly from age. 3 words and a number, CVC, 847. VC Vincent Caruso. And 847, that was an FBI case file designation prefix I recognized from a different investigation, years earlier. It was a prefix associated with organized crime financial cases out of the New York field office. Someone, in 2003, doing due diligence on a property that Donato Marchetti was in the process of acquiring, had looked at that property and thought of a federal organized crime case and a man named Vincent Caruso. And then, for reasons I didn't yet understand, nothing had happened. I held that photocopy for a long time. I turned it over in my hands. I thought about all the things it might mean and all the things it might not mean, and I decided that it was time to go to New York. His name was Frank DeLuca, and he had been an NYPD detective for 22 years, assigned for the last 8 of those years to the Organized Crime Investigations Division, before he retired in 2001 at the age of 48. 48 is young to retire from the NYPD, young enough that it deserves a question, and the question I had prepared was gentle and indirect. But as it turned out, Frank DeLuca didn't need gentle or indirect. He opened his front door, looked at me, and said, "I wondered when someone was going to come." He lived in a small house on Staten Island, 20 minutes from the cemetery where Vincent Caruso was supposedly buried. He was in his early 70s now, thick through the middle, with the careful stillness of a man who had spent decades learning to control what his face showed. He made coffee. He sat across from me at his kitchen table. And then, for 3 hours, he talked. I am going to compress what DeLuca told me, because some of it requires context I'll provide later, and some of it I cannot yet fully verify and need to be careful about how I present. But the core of it was this. In the late 1990s, DeLuca had been part of a joint task force, NYPD and FBI, that was looking at the financial reconstruction of several organized crime families following the prosecutions of the late 1980s and early 1990s. It was understood within law enforcement circles that the families had been damaged by those prosecutions but not destroyed, and that they were rebuilding, in ways that were more sophisticated than before. More deeply embedded in legitimate commerce, harder to see. In the course of that investigation, DeLuca had encountered the name Donato Marchetti. Not as a target, initially, as a flag. A financial analyst on the task force had noticed the Marchetti organization's pattern of acquisitions and flagged them as potentially consistent with the laundering typology they were studying. It was one of dozens of flags. Most of them went nowhere. But DeLuca had pulled the Marchetti thread a little harder than the others. And what he found had made him deeply uneasy. Not because he found proof of anything. He hadn't, not at that stage. But because of the shape of what wasn't there. The background on Marchetti had a smoothness to it, a completeness, that struck DeLuca, who had spent years looking at fraudulent identities as artificial. Real people's histories have rough edges. Records that don't quite agree with each other. Employers who remember you slightly differently than your resume says. Education records with minor inconsistencies. Marchetti's background was too clean. Not wrong, but too right. Too well made. DeLuca had taken his concerns to his supervisor. His supervisor had taken them to the liaison with the FBI. And there, DeLuca told me, the conversation had stopped. Not abruptly. Not in a way that was overtly strange. But the Marchetti thread had been deprioritized, reassigned, and eventually dropped. DeLuca had asked why, twice, and had been given explanations that were technically reasonable and that he had not believed. Someone made a call, he said to me, over his kitchen table, with a flatness in his voice that I recognized as the particular exhaustion of a man who has known something for a long time and has had to live with not being able to prove it. I don't know who. I don't know exactly where in the chain it happened. But someone with enough authority to reach into that task force and tap the brakes made a call. And after that, Anybody who looked too hard at Marchetti was going to find themselves in a different conversation than they expected. He paused. He looked at his coffee cup. I retired a year later, he said. Which I know is how that sounds. And I can't tell you that those two things are unconnected, because I don't know that. What I know is that after 22 years of doing this work, I didn't recognize the room I was in anymore. And I thought it was better to leave than to stay and pretend otherwise. I asked him about Vincent Caruso. I asked him carefully, watching his face. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered. Caruso's dead, he said. That's the official record. Is that what you believe? I asked. Another long pause. Then, I believe the man in that grave on Staten Island is not Vincent Caruso. And I have believed that for 20 years. And I have never been able to prove it, and I have been very careful not to say it out loud, until right now, to you. I asked him how. He said, you need to understand what WITSEC can and can't do. What it does well. New identity, new location, new life. What it can't do is control the witness after they're in the program. It can monitor, it can check in, but it's not a prison. And there are always people, who will help a man like Caruso, for the right reasons, meaning the wrong reasons. Men with history, men who owe him, men who have their own interest in keeping a former Genovese financial coordinator alive and grateful and quietly productive. He said one more thing before I left, and I have thought about it many times since. He said, the thing about Vincent Caruso is that he was genuinely brilliant at what he did. Moving money, building structures, making connections between legitimate and illegitimate worlds look natural. That's not a skill that goes away when you change your name. If anything, it gets better with practice. And a man like that, operating completely outside any official record, with a new identity and a city that doesn't know what it's looking at, that man can build something remarkable. And dangerous. I want to tell you about something that happened 6 weeks into my investigation, because it changed the texture of everything that came after. I had been careful in the way that investigative journalists learn to be careful when they are working on something sensitive, using secure communications where possible, varying my research patterns, not concentrating my searches in ways that might be noticed, keeping my notes in a form that was not easily interpretable by anyone who might encounter them accidentally or otherwise. These are standard precautions. They are not perfect. They are better than nothing. One afternoon, I came back to my apartment to find that my door was unlocked. I am certain, with the kind of bodily certainty that doesn't require argument, that I had locked it when I left. Nothing was visibly disturbed inside. My laptop was where I had left it. My files were where I had left them. Nothing was missing, but a photograph on my desk, a photo of my daughter, who is 9 years old and lives with her father in Baltimore, had been turned to face the wall. I stood in the middle of my apartment for a long time. I checked every room. I checked the locks on every window. I sat down on my couch and I breathed, steadily, in and out, the way you do when you are trying to stay functional and your body is trying very hard to have a different conversation with you. Then I called Margaret. She listened to me describe it. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had the particular quality of someone choosing their words with extreme deliberateness. She said, Sarah, I need you to think very carefully about whether you want to continue with this. I said, I'm not stopping. She said, I know. I knew you were going to say that. So I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. She paused. The name you gave me, Marchetti. I did some looking of my own. Not too much. I was careful, but enough to see that there are filings associated with his organization that have markers of seen before in cases involving individuals with government-adjacent status. I said, what does that mean? She said, it means that the money this man is moving, some of it, not all of it, but some, is moving in ways that suggest it is not purely criminal. It has a shape that I have seen in cases where law enforcement has a financial relationship with an individual. Where there is an ongoing arrangement. Where someone in an official capacity is not just looking the other way but is actively participating in the infrastructure. I felt something go cold in my chest. You're saying he's still an asset, I said. I'm saying it's possible, she said. I'm saying the structure is consistent with that. I'm saying that if I'm right, then the reason Frank DeLuca hit a wall in 1999 is not just that someone made a call to protect a witness. It's that the witness was still producing, still valuable, still, in some formal or informal sense, under the umbrella. She said, and I'm saying that means the people protecting him are not just criminals, Sarah. They're federal, and that changes everything about how dangerous this is. After I hung up, I sat at my desk and I looked at my daughter's photograph, which I had turned back to face forward, and I thought about Baltimore, and about the 9-year-old girl who called me every night before bed and talked to me about her soccer team and her teacher and the book she was reading. And I thought about the choice that Margaret was describing, which was not really a choice at all, not for the woman I have been trying to be. But which had very real weight to it, very real and very personal weight, that I would be dishonest not to acknowledge. I called my ex-husband that night. I told him, without specifics, without details that would frighten him more than necessary, that I was working on something sensitive and that I wanted to make sure he was taking ordinary precautions. He knew me well enough to understand what that meant. He said he would. We talked for a while, longer than we usually do, about our daughter, about her soccer tournament that weekend, about ordinary things. When I hung up, I felt both better and worse, which is often how it goes. There is a man I need to tell you about now who is, in many ways, the most tragic figure in this story. His name is, I should say, because as far as I know he is still alive, though I have not been able to confirm his location for some time now. His name is Michael Caruso. Michael Caruso is Vincent Caruso's son. He was 8 years old when his father entered WITSEC and was officially declared dead. He grew up believing his father was dead. I learned from court records and from a conversation with a social worker who had worked with the family in the early 1990s and was willing to speak with me, spent his childhood and adolescence in the particular grief of a fatherless boy who has been told that his loss is permanent and final. He had visited the grave on Staten Island. He had built his life around an absence. Except that in 2009, Michael Caruso, then 29, working as a contractor in New Jersey, had seen a photograph in a Philadelphia business magazine. A profile of a developer named Donato Marchetti, who had just broken ground on a major waterfront project. A photograph of a man in his early 60s, heavier than he had been, gray where he had been dark, with a beard he hadn't had before. But with his father's eyes, with his father's particular way of standing, right hand in jacket pocket, head slightly tilted. With something in the angle of his jaw that Michael Caruso had been looking at in photographs his entire life without knowing he would ever see it again on a living face. Michael had not gone to the police. He had not gone to the FBI. He had not gone to anyone official, because he was, after all, the son of a man who had testified against the Genovese family, and he had grown up understanding that certain conversations had certain consequences, and that the institutional protections available to people like his family were real but limited and conditional. What Michael Caruso had done was drive to Philadelphia. What had happened at that meeting, if it had happened, and I believe it had, I cannot tell you fully, because Michael is the one person in this story who will not talk to me, who will not talk to anyone, whose silence is so complete and so carefully maintained that it functions as its own kind of message. But I can tell you what I believe happened, based on what I found afterward. I believe that Vincent Caruso, Donato Marchetti, had met with his son. I believe that the meeting had been, in its way, a reunion. I believe that some version of the truth had been told, or at least enough of the truth to explain what Michael was seeing. And I believe that Michael, who had spent 20 years grieving a man who was not dead, had been faced with a choice that was almost unbearably complicated: report what he knew, which meant destroying his father's life and potentially his own safety, or accept the secret and carry it. I believe Michael had accepted the secret, and I believe that the weight of it had been doing something to him ever since. I found Michael through property records. He had, in the years following 2009, made several investments in Philadelphia area real estate that were modest by Marchetti's standards but that were strikingly consistent with the Marchetti organization's pattern. Not connected directly, there was care taken, deliberate care, to keep the distance visible. But the pattern was there, for anyone who knew what to look for. The son had come back to the father had brought the son in, and the son was now, however inadvertently, however desperately, part of the same structure. I drove to the address I had for Michael 3 times before I gave up. The first time, no one answered. The second time, a woman I didn't recognize opened the door, looked at me, said she didn't know anyone by that name, and closed the door before I could respond. The third time, the house was empty. For sale. A sign in the window, a lockbox on the door, the particular blankness of a place that has been vacated in a hurry. Someone had told him I was asking about him. I didn't know who. I had been careful, but not careful enough, or careful in the wrong direction, and somewhere in my inquiry about Michael Caruso, a signal had been sent that had moved him. I stood on the sidewalk in front of that empty house in New Jersey on a cold November afternoon and I felt the investigation shift around me. It had been abstract before, in the way that investigations are abstract when they are about documents and patterns and structures. It was no longer abstract. Real people were being moved, in real time, because of questions I was asking. And I had no way of knowing yet whether being moved meant being protected or being silenced. There is a particular kind of bank that appears in money laundering cases with remarkable frequency, and it is not the kind of bank you would expect. It is not an offshore haven with a Cayman Islands address and a name that sounds like a tax dodge. It is a small community bank, or a regional commercial bank, the kind with branches in strip malls and a president who coaches Little League and a loan committee that meets on Wednesday mornings and genuinely believes, most of the time, that it is doing legitimate business. These banks are useful precisely because they are legitimate. Their compliance infrastructure is real but limited. They follow the law, they file the required reports, but they don't have the forensic capacity of a major institutional bank, and they are susceptible to relationships in a way that larger banks are not. A community bank in a mid-sized American city is not going to turn down a major depositor and a reliable borrower who brings in significant commercial real estate activity and who has been a valued client for 15 years and who plays golf with the chairman of the board. The bank I am talking about is a real institution, and I am not going to name it in this recording, for reasons that will become clear and that I want to be transparent about. I am not naming it because I do not yet have documentation sufficient to support a direct accusation, and because the individuals at the bank whom I believe were complicit are, in at least one case, someone whose cooperation I am still attempting to obtain. I will say that the bank is headquartered in the Philadelphia metropolitan area and that it has been the primary depository for the Marchetti organization's operating accounts for approximately 12 years. The person at that bank I want to tell you about is someone I will call Thomas. Thomas was a senior vice president for commercial lending, and he had been handling the Marchetti account personally for 9 of those 12 years. Thomas was not an obvious criminal. Thomas was, by the accounts of his colleagues and his family and his community, a good man, a church-going man, a family man, a man who had worked hard and built a career that he was proud of. Thomas also had a problem, the kind of problem that certain men develop in middle age when their life has moved in a direction they didn't plan and the gap between what they expected and what they have becomes too wide to look at directly. Thomas had a gambling problem, not a small one, a serious one, the kind that leaves forensic traces, trips to Atlantic City that appear in credit card records, wire transfers that don't quite make sense given his income, a pattern of cash withdrawals that a careful examiner would notice. Someone had noticed, and someone had made Thomas an offer that resolved the immediate problem while creating a much larger, much more permanent one. I found Thomas through a former employee of the bank who had left under circumstances that were described to me with considerable care, as having involved a disagreement about the appropriate handling of certain large commercial accounts. This former employee, I will call her Diane, had not been prepared to talk when I first reached her. She had been prepared. 9 months later, after I had established trust with her through a process that involved several preliminary conversations, the sharing of some of what I had already found, and a difficult but necessary discussion about what journalism can and cannot offer a source in terms of protection. What Diane told me was that Thomas had, over a period of several years, approved loan applications for Marchetti-associated entities that did not meet the bank's own underwriting standards. Not egregiously, the files were prepared carefully enough to pass a surface review. But the underlying financials, if examined by someone who understood the Marchetti structure, revealed circularities, money that the borrower was using as collateral that had, in an earlier form, come from the same lending institution. Round trips, the money borrowed, deployed in a way that generated the revenue needed to service the debt, returned to the bank as deposits, reborrowed. A perpetual motion machine of clean-looking capital. Diane had raised a question about one of these loans, not a formal objection, not a compliance report, a question, in a meeting, to Thomas. Thomas had given her an answer that was technically responsive and that she had not been satisfied with. 2 weeks later, she had been informed that her position was being eliminated in a restructuring. She had received a severance package and a separation agreement that included, as these agreements typically do, a non-disparagement clause. She had signed the agreement. She had honored it, she told me, for years. Then she had reached a point. I will not describe the personal circumstances that brought her to that point, because they are hers and not mine to share, where the weight of what she knew had become heavier than the weight of the agreement. She gave me documents, not the most sensitive documents. She had not retained those, and even if she had, there were limits to what she was willing to risk, but enough. Internal memos, loan committee notes, a due diligence summary on one of the Marchetti entities that contained, in its footnotes, a reference to a prior examination of the entity's financial history that had been commissioned and then not acted upon. The kind of reference that, in a document that is supposed to be thorough, suggests that someone made a deliberate choice to stop looking. I sat with Diane's documents for several weeks, comparing them against the public records I had assembled, matching dates, tracing entities. What emerged was a picture that was not yet complete but that had a recognizable shape, the shape of an arrangement that had been running long enough, and carefully enough, to have become normalized. Everyone involved had adapted to it. It had become, in the most dangerous possible sense, routine. At some point in any investigation of this kind, you arrive at a moment where the question is no longer what happened but what you do about it. I was, by this point, about 18 months into my work. I had a picture that I believed was substantially accurate, though I also knew that I had gaps, important gaps that any serious editor would identify immediately and that any lawyer retained by Marchetti's organization would exploit without hesitation. I had enough to believe. I did not yet have enough to publish. Or rather, I had enough to publish something, but not enough to publish everything, and the something without the everything was, I believed, potentially more dangerous than saying nothing at all. Half-true stories about powerful and ruthless people have a way of being managed. Whole truths are harder to dismiss. But I was also aware that 18 months of investigation had not been invisible. I had been warned, in the way of the turned photograph, and in other ways I have not described yet, that people were aware of my interest and were watching it. Every day I waited was a day in which documents could disappear, sources could be moved, and the story I was trying to tell could become more difficult to tell accurately. There is a particular loneliness in this position. I know that sounds strange. I had sources, I had colleagues I trusted, I had my editor at the national outlet that had agreed to support the investigation. I was not without resources. But the loneliness is real anyway, because the decisions are yours. The risk calculus is yours. No one else can do it for you. My editor could advise me, and did, wisely and seriously. My colleagues could help me think through the reporting gaps, and they did. But the question of when it was enough, when the story was solid enough and the danger was acute enough and the public interest was clear enough to justify the consequences, that was mine. And it kept me awake at night in a way that was different from ordinary professional pressure, because the consequences I was weighing were not only mine. My daughter's birthday was in 3 weeks. I had promised to take her to the coast for a long weekend, just the two of us, and I was very much planning to keep that promise. I was also very much aware, every day, of the gap between the world I was living in professionally and the world she lived in, and of my responsibility to maintain that gap as long as I possibly could. I want to talk honestly about this, because I think the popular image of investigative journalism, the journalist as crusader, righteous and fearless, driven purely by the imperative of the truth, does a disservice to the real experience of this work, and to the people who do it. Fear is real. The weight of responsibility to people other than yourself is real. The calculation is never purely abstract. And anyone who tells you they have done this work without feeling those things is either lying or has not done this work in a way that put anything real at stake. What moved me forward, in the end, was not the absence of fear. It was something more complicated than that. It was the memory of Frank DeLuca sitting across from me at his kitchen table on Staten Island, saying, "I wondered when someone was going to come." 20 years. He had known what he knew for 20 years, and he had not been able to tell it, and the knowing had shaped his retirement and his silence and the particular quality of his stillness. It was the thought of Diane, who had signed a piece of paper and honored it for years while what she knew sat inside her like something with weight. It was the thought of Michael Caruso, 8 years old at his father's fake funeral, building a life around an absence that was a lie. And it was something else, something more uncomfortable. It was the thought of the people whose money was being laundered. Not the organization, the people whose lives that money had come from. The drug trade doesn't produce clean casualties. The extortion networks that feed this kind of operation touch real people, small business owners, people trying to make a living, people whose vulnerability was exploited in order to generate the capital that Donato Marchetti, née Vincent Caruso, née Robert Fisk, was passing through his construction projects and his bank accounts and returning to circulation as clean money that built things with his name on them. Those people had names too, even if I didn't know them. I decided to push forward. I decided to push forward and to do it faster, because I had the distinct feeling, not paranoid, I want to be clear, not imaginary, but grounded in specific things I had observed in the preceding weeks, that my window was closing. That someone, somewhere, was making a decision about whether my investigation was a manageable nuisance or a genuine threat, and that the answer to that question would determine what happened next. I need to tell you more about the man I called Eddie. The man from the district attorney's office who had sent me the appraisal with the handwritten note. I had been trying to reach him for months. The intermediary who had passed me his document was not willing to facilitate direct contact. That had been the arrangement, and pushing it would have endangered the intermediary and possibly Eddie as well. I had a first name and I had the context of his workplace and I had the document. And I had spent a considerable amount of time trying to identify him without asking questions that would be noticed. I identified him through a combination of the document itself and public records. The appraisal had certain characteristics, formatting conventions, a reference to a specific methodology, that were consistent with a particular period in commercial real estate practice. The note in the margin was written in a hand that, when I compared it to signatures on public court filings that I found over several weeks of research, matched a specific individual, an assistant district attorney who had been with the Philadelphia DA's office since the mid-1990s and who had, over his career, worked on financial crimes cases with particular frequency. I will call him Eddie because that is close to his real name and because he has not given me permission to identify him fully. What I can tell you is that he had been in the DA's office for close to 30 years, and that he had, over those decades, accumulated the kind of institutional knowledge that makes certain people very dangerous to anyone who wishes to keep secrets. When I finally found a way to reach him that I was confident was not being observed, I will not describe the method, for reasons that should be obvious, his response was not what I expected. He didn't refuse. He didn't deny. He said, "It took you long enough. We met in person, Twice. Both times in places of his choosing, at his insistence. Both times he arrived before me, checked the space carefully in ways that a professional would recognize, and sat with his back to the wall. He was a careful man who had been careful for a long time, and the caution had become structural. It was not anxiety, it was procedure. What Eddie told me confirmed and extended what I already had in ways that I found both invaluable and deeply unsettling. He had known about the connection between Marchetti and the Caruso identity since approximately 2004. He had come to it the way I had, through financial patterns, through records that didn't quite fit, through a process of accumulation that took years. He had assembled a file. He had brought it to his supervisor. His supervisor had brought it up the chain. And then something had happened that Eddie described with a precision that told me he had rehearsed the telling of it, that he had been carrying it for a long time and had worked out a federal attorney. He gave me the title, not the name, and I have my own belief about who it was but cannot confirm it, had visited the DA's office. Formally, through official channels, with proper credentials and a cover story about a multi-jurisdictional financial investigation that the federal office was coordinating. In a meeting that included Eddie's supervisor and 2 other senior members of the office, this federal attorney had communicated, with great care and in language that was precise and deniable, that the Marchetti financial investigation was in conflict with an ongoing federal matter of significant sensitivity, and that the continuation of the state-level inquiry would create complications that would be unfortunate for all parties. He didn't say stop, Eddie told me. That's the thing. He was very careful not to say stop. What he said was that there were considerations that the DA's office was not in a position to fully appreciate, and that proceeding without coordination with the federal office could compromise something that had taken years to build. I asked, and your supervisor's response? Eddie looked at me. My supervisor's response was to thank the federal attorney for his time and to assure him that the DA's office understood the importance of interagency cooperation. And then, after the meeting, my supervisor called me into his office and told me that the Marchetti file needed to be shelved pending clarification of the federal situation. I asked, how long ago was this? He said, 15 years ago. I asked, and the file? He said, it exists. I have maintained it, informally, my own copies, my own records. Not on any official system. In 15 years, nobody has asked me about it, which tells you something about how confident people are that it's been handled. He looked at me steadily. He said, I sent you that appraisal because I have been waiting for 15 years for someone to come along who could do something with what I have. Someone who is outside the system. Someone who can't be called into an office and told that there are considerations they don't fully appreciate. He reached into his jacket and took out a thumb drive. He put it on the table between us. Everything on here is legally obtained, he said. Every document, every record. Everything I did to assemble this was within the scope of my official duties at the time I did it. I have been very careful about that. Very careful. He paused. Which means that if someone comes after me for giving it to you, the conversation about how it was obtained is going to be a very interesting one for them to have in public. I picked up the thumb drive. I spent 6 days going through the contents of Eddie's drive. I want to be straightforward with you. What was on that drive was extraordinary. Not because any single document was a smoking gun, though some of them were close, but because of the aggregation. Because of the picture that emerged when you laid it all out and understood how the pieces fit together. There were financial records, hundreds of pages of them, loan documents, wire transfer records, account statements, appraisals, corporate filings, tax returns. The picture they painted, taken together, was a systematic and sophisticated laundering operation that had been running for at minimum 15 years and that had moved, by the rough estimates I developed with Margaret's help, somewhere between $80 and $120 million through the Marchetti organization's accounts. There were communications, emails, some of them obtained through warrant in connection with other investigations that had glanced off the Marchetti organization without ever focusing on it directly. Internal communications between Marchetti entities and their professional advisors, lawyers and accountants whose involvement raised its own set of serious questions. And, most significantly, a series of communications between an individual identified in the file only by a federal employee number. Eddie would not tell me who this number corresponded to, and I have not been able to determine it with certainty, and what appeared to be a handler or contact within an agency that the documents did not name but that, given context, I believe to have been either the FBI or the Marshal's Service. These communications, which were fragmentary, Eddie had pieces, not the whole, described, in bureaucratic language, the ongoing management of an arrangement with an unnamed individual whose cooperation had generated significant value over a period of years and whose continued productive relationship with the government was dependent on a certain degree of operational flexibility. Operational flexibility was the phrase used. I wrote it down and I looked at it for a long time. What it appeared to describe, in the language that I had come to understand over 3 years of reading these documents and talking to people who knew what they were looking at, was this: Vincent Caruso, operating as Donato Marchetti, had not simply escaped from the witness security program and gone rogue. He had, at some point, I believe in the mid to late 1990s, re-established a relationship with elements of federal law enforcement. A new arrangement, not WITSEC, something less formal, less documented, more flexible. An arrangement in which Caruso continued to provide information about organized crime, about financial networks, about the movement of criminal capital through legitimate business, and in exchange received a degree of protection that was not official but was real. He had been, for 20 years or more, an asset. A ghost asset, an asset whose existence and whose arrangement were not in any official system, whose relationship with the government was maintained through informal channels and individual relationships rather than through the institutional framework of the Witness Protection Program. And because he was a ghost, he was also free. Free to operate in ways that a formally registered asset could not. Free to build the Marchetti organization, to run the money laundering operation, to accumulate the properties and the power and the identity. Free, because the people who knew about him had an interest in his continued productivity and no interest in the complications that formal accountability would create. I am telling you this because I believe it to be true. I am also telling you that it is the part of this story that I find most disturbing, not the criminal activity, not the false identity, not even the corruption of the financial system. Those are serious, but this is something more fundamental. This is about what happens when government protection becomes government complicity, when the arrangement that is supposed to serve justice becomes the mechanism by which justice is indefinitely deferred. When the people who are supposed to be on one side of the line have found a way to stand astride it, collecting from both directions. I thought about Frank DeLuca. I thought about his phrase, I didn't recognize the room I was in anymore. I thought I was beginning to understand what he meant. I received a phone call 3 weeks before I finished writing my report. It was from a number I didn't recognize, and it was not the same number as the original call, the call at 2:47 in the morning that had started all of this. But the voice was the same. "You've been busy," the man said. I said, "Who are you?" A pause. Then, "I'm someone who knew Vincent Caruso. A long time ago, someone who knew what he was and what he could do and who made a judgment, a long time ago, that having him out in the world in a useful capacity was better than having him in a cell or having him dead. A judgment that I have reconsidered, many times, over many years." I said, "Are you law enforcement?" He said, "I was." I said, "Why did you call me the first time?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had something in it that I would describe as grief, if grief can exist in a voice that is also completely controlled. He said, "Because he has a daughter. A real daughter, not from before. A daughter who was born in Philadelphia, who was raised by Donato Marchetti, who loves her father. Who has no idea, and she is 23 years old and she works for him and she is, without knowing it, participating in what he has built. And I am old and I am tired and I decided that someone needed to know this before it went further. Before she went further, I asked if I could talk to him more, if I could meet him. He said, "You have what you need. You don't need me." I said, "I need to be able to attribute something. I need a record." He said, "No, you need to publish what you have and let the pieces fall where they fall. What happens after that is not your responsibility." And then, as he had the first time, he hung up. I sat with my editor for 4 hours, 2 days after that call. We sat in a conference room with the door closed and we went through everything, every document, every source, every inference. We talked about what we could prove and what we could not, about what was solid and what was shaky, about the legal exposure and the ethical obligations and the question of timing. My editor, and I want to say this clearly, because it matters, pushed back on me hard. Not against publishing, but against publishing too soon, before the gaps were filled, before the sourcing was complete. She was right to push. She was right, and I knew she was right, and we argued about it anyway, the way you argue when you are scared that right might not be enough. There was one gap in particular that she kept returning to. I did not have confirmation of the identity. I had the evidence of the identity, the financial records, the testimony of DeLuca, the documents from Eddie, the structural analysis of the Marchetti organization. But I did not have a document that said directly, "This man is Vincent Caruso." I did not have a DNA comparison. I did not have a witness who had known both men and could confirm they were the same person. I had a very strong case built from inference and circumstantial evidence. And I had a source who had told me over the phone, in an unrecorded call, that the man in the grave was not Vincent Caruso. But I did not have the final piece. 2 things happened in the week after that meeting that changed the calculation. The first, Michael Caruso surfaced. Not to me, not directly. But a lawyer contacted my editor. A lawyer retained, the letter said, to represent a client who had information material to an investigation of which we were believed to be aware. The letter was careful and legalistic and it communicated, between its lines, that the client was prepared to participate in our reporting under specific conditions related to immunity and protection of identity. We did not have the ability to offer immunity. Only the government can offer immunity. But we could offer protection of identity, and we could offer, in exchange for cooperation, a commitment to present the client's perspective fairly. Michael Caruso, through his lawyer, gave us a statement. I cannot reproduce the statement in full here, legal advice, and my own judgment, but the substance of it was this: he confirmed that the man he knew as Donato Marchetti was his father. He confirmed the meeting in 2009. He confirmed that his father was alive. He confirmed, and this cost him something, you could feel it in the careful phrasing, that he had participated, knowingly, in certain aspects of the Marchetti organization's activities after 2009. The second thing that happened, Donato Marchetti held a press conference. Not about our investigation, he didn't know the specifics of it. Or if he did, he was playing a different game. The press conference was about a new development project, a major mixed-use project on the Philadelphia waterfront, the largest thing the Marchetti organization had ever attempted. He stood at a podium with the mayor beside him and talked about investment and jobs and the future of the city. He was confident, he was practiced, he was completely, masterfully in control of the image he was projecting. I watched it on a live stream on my laptop, in my home office, with my notes spread around me. I watched him and I thought, this man has been someone else for 30 years. He has been so completely someone else that the someone else is real now. More real, in many ways, than the man he was before. He has a daughter, he has a city, he has a name on buildings. And he has, underneath all of it, the unresolved account of everything that was done in the building of it. All the people who were moved and managed and silenced and compromised and implicated. All the money that passed through his hands with its invisible history of harm. All the federal authority that was bent around the needs of his protection. I thought, the truth is not going to resolve any of this cleanly. There is no clean resolution available. His daughter will learn who her father is. Michael Caruso will face consequences for what he admitted. The bank employees and the lawyers and the compliant officials will find themselves in the harsh light of public attention and legal scrutiny. The federal officials who maintained the ghost arrangement will face. I don't know what they will face, because the institutional protections available to federal law enforcement are significant, and I am not naive about that. Frank DeLuca will be asked questions he has been waiting 20 years to answer. Eddie will have to decide how much of his own story he is willing to make public. And Donato Marchetti, who was Vincent Caruso, who was Robert Fisk, who was a man who died in a New Jersey federal building and was buried in a Staten Island cemetery and built himself back into the world through the only skills he had. Donato Marchetti will have to answer for everything. Or he will not, depending on forces that are larger than my journalism and more powerful than any single story. I don't know which it will be. I genuinely do not know. I submitted the story. My editor published it. That was 4 months ago now, and the aftermath has been, I want to choose the word carefully, substantial. There is a federal investigation. I know this because I have been contacted by investigators and because sources in the federal system have confirmed it, cautiously and off the record. I do not know its scope or its direction or where it leads. Donato Marchetti has not commented publicly. His organization has retained legal counsel and issued a statement through that counsel that describes the reporting as inaccurate and defamatory, without specifying what, specifically, is inaccurate. This is a standard legal posture, and I do not put great weight on it either way. The bank that I described, I have named it in the published story, though not in this recording, is under regulatory examination. Thomas, the banker, has retained counsel. I have not spoken to him. Michael Caruso's lawyer contacted my editor a week after publication to say that his client was cooperating with investigators and would have no further comment. Eddie has been placed on administrative leave while his own conduct in the matter is reviewed. I believe this is, in part, a bureaucratic defense mechanism, the institution protecting itself from the implication that it knew what Eddie knew and did nothing. I believe Eddie expected this and is prepared for it. Frank DeLuca has given an on-record interview to a major newspaper. He said, among other things, I waited 23 years for someone to come along who could do what Sarah Voss did. 23 years is a long time. I should have found a way sooner. I read that and I held it for a while. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. There is no version of this story in which 23 years of silence is okay. There is also no version of it in which a man in Frank DeLuca's position, with Frank DeLuca's constraints, was simply free to do otherwise. Both things are true and they don't resolve each other. The man who called me, the man who started all of this, I have not heard from again. I don't know who he is, with certainty. I have my strong suspicion, based on the description he gave of himself and the period of time he referenced and the specificity of his knowledge. If I am right, he is in his late 70s now. If I am right, he spent a significant part of his career in a federal law enforcement position. And he made decisions in that position that he has lived with for decades, and at some point those decisions became too heavy to carry in silence and he picked up a phone at 2:47 in the morning and called a journalist he didn't know. I think about that a lot, about what it takes to carry something that long, about the math we do, consciously or not, about what is survivable and what isn't, about when the cost of silence finally exceeds the cost of speaking. His daughter, Marchetti's daughter, the young woman who is 23 years old and who went to work every day for a man she loved and thought she knew, I have not tried to contact her. I have thought about it. I have had long arguments with myself about whether it was my responsibility to reach her before the story was published, to give her some form of warning, some preparation for what was coming. I decided not to, and I am not fully at peace with that decision. My reasoning was that any contact I made would be observed, would potentially accelerate the events in ways I couldn't control, would possibly endanger the story and possibly endanger her. My reasoning was sound. It was also, in some irreducible way, a choice to prioritize the story over her readiness for what the story would do to her life. That is the thing about this work that doesn't get simpler the longer you do it. There are no clean hands. There is only the attempt to do the most important thing with the most integrity you can muster, in conditions that are never ideal. With information that is always incomplete, with consequences that are never entirely in your control. The name on the stone in that cemetery on Staten Island is Vincent Caruso. I don't know whose body is underneath it. I have asked the federal investigators about this. They have not answered. I think, if I'm honest, that this particular question may never be answered, because the answer requires someone to officially acknowledge the existence of an arrangement that the government has every institutional incentive to deny ever happened. There are things in this story that I believe will result in prosecutions. There are things that I believe will result in nothing, that will be managed and absorbed and gradually forgotten in the way that complicated truths are forgotten when they implicate too many people with too much to lose. I filed for the renewal of my apartment's lease last month. My editor has asked me what I'm working on next. My daughter's soccer team made the semifinals. The water stain on my ceiling still looks like a running dog. My phone rings sometimes from numbers I don't recognize. I answer all of them now. I always answer. You never know which call is the one that changes everything.